Today, on episode number 524 of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, Toward a More Critical Framework for AI Use, with Jon Ippolito.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. I'm Bonnie Stahoviak, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to improve our productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. I am so glad to be welcoming to the show today Jon Ippolito. He's an artist, writer, and curator who teaches new media and digital curation at the University of Maine. Winner of Tiffany, Lannan, American Foundation, and TAMA Awards, Ippolito is co-founder of the Variable Media Network for Preserving New Media Art, University of Maine's digital curation and just-in-time learning programs, and Learning with AI, a toolkit for educators and students that makes it easy to filter for AI assignments and resources by discipline or purpose. Ippolito has given over 200 presentations, co-authored the books At the Edge of Art and Recollection, Art, New Media, and Social Memory, and published 80 chapters and articles in periodicals from Artform to the Washington Post. His AI focus is creators, writers, programmers, and media makers, and how the technical, aesthetic, and legal ramifications of generative AI empower and frustrate them. Jon Ippolito, welcome to Teaching in Higher Ed.
Thanks, Bonnie. Glad to be here.
Would you take us back to the early 1990s and tell us about the mix-up in what job you thought you were applying for at the Guggenheim and the job you actually got?
Fresh out of art school, didn't have a lot of options. I had some background in martial arts and I knew something about art history. So I applied to the Guggenheim to be a guard because they had a program where guards with art history backgrounds could also be docents. Save money, have one person watch over the Picasso at the same time they can explain what the Picasso is about. I made a mistake, got in the wrong interview, applied to be a curator, ended up being hired as one.
Oh, it's fascinating. You've probably seen those memes where it's, here's where I started and here's how people think success works. And it's this linear line of this forward and upward trajectory. And everything that I've learned about you seems like you would draw a very different picture in your here's how things actually turned out, including that early job interview.
It would be a very twisty, twirly mess. The one thing I always remind people, one of my students, Zev Eisenberg, who's now creates mobile games for the iPhone for the New York Times, he always warns me about survivorship bias, a term you might have heard, which is like just because someone, made it big or achieved something doesn't mean you can follow their footsteps. And the classic sort of joke about that is someone saying, I was poor my whole life, but then I just bought a lottery ticket every week and here I am rich and you can do that too.
Well, I have had such a blast. This was an unusual experience having you sign up for an interview because you signed up for a time that was in less than 24 hours from when we were actually talking today. And I both love that because you're so fascinating that I could have really gone and practically written a master's thesis before I was even remotely close to being done being curious. So I'm so excited about today's conversation and grateful for your time before you head out of town. Would you first talk to us about intelligence? Before we start talking about artificial intelligence, let's just talk about intelligence in general. How would you casually define intelligence?
There's a lot of different kinds of intelligence, obviously, emotional, intellectual. Another of my colleagues at the University of Maine, Jolene Blake, likes to talk about maker intelligence, which again is someone who can perhaps produce creative, really interesting things that require a medium or some kind of activity to realize themselves or to be seen by others. In school, we tend to validate intelligence that comes about from someone being able to summarize a book that they read or write articulate paragraphs about the French Revolution or in other ways, verbally either elaborate on or possibly extend things that they have already seen and more commonly read. So again, words have been the sort of gold standard of what intelligence has meant in at least the US and many other school systems. Now we're at a point where word simulation, language simulation is ubiquitous, and it's not coming from people. And it's certainly not coming from, if it is being used by people, it's not necessarily a marker of their intelligence. So that sort of sense of the word intelligence is really broken now. And we need to kind of either rethink what intelligence means beyond the scope of simply being articulate and knowledgeable when it comes to putting words together, or we need to think about what other values we want to promote and encourage and teach that go beyond intelligence. So one that I'm particularly interested in, especially as it relates to large language models, is creativity, which is not the same as intelligence, but is another potential. What would I say? It's even hard to describe exactly what it is because it's unclear. Is nature creative? Is a baby, a child who's picked up a crayon for the first time and touches paper, are they creative? Is it a faculty? Is it a skill that can be learned? Is it a talent that's in sort of that's genetic, that somehow emerges as someone gets older? But that's one of the many sort of facets of intelligence I'm personally interested in.
Oh, and you talked about giving a child a crayon. One of the areas of research I've seen around that I was thinking of as you were sharing is there's the idea of, am I good at it inherently, or are these skills that could be built? What I instantly thought of is that we can hinder imagination when we start listing off the things. So if you give a child a toy and you say, oh, let me show you a little bit about how this toy works. You could pull on this thing, and then this little thing over here shares music. But instead, if you just give them the toy, the research that I saw, they'll come up with way more things that the toy can do and be a lot more creative about its possibility if we don't start with let me give you the little tutorial for how this thing works, and instead just kind of get them playing with it. And that might actually be a fun way for us to start to talk about artificial intelligence, because you are someone who I perceive as playing with it and experimenting with it and encouraging others to do so. Is that a fair estimation that you might be energized by or interested in kind of the playful aspects of artificial intelligence? Perhaps even just to see what it can't do in addition to what it might be able to do.
Yeah, I do think that's fair. I think that there's a very critical piece to that I should come back to later. But one of the things I've noted as someone who's sort of looked at the history of how artists in particular have used technology is that people who are perhaps less creative will look at the manual, right? Artists don't look at the manual. They immediately start messing with something and often see if they can break it and or misuse the technology in ways it wasn't intended. So there are artists, for example, who created the very first web animations. This is back in the very early days of Netscape 2, right? So we're talking mid-90s, before Flash, before Director, before JavaScript. There was a way to fake a sort of succession of images and colors on a web page by adding multiple HTML tags in a row, which is illegal. You're not supposed to be able to put more than one body tag. But in this case, they quickly found that they could sort of hack their way into a primitive kind of animation this way. That didn't last long because the browsers fixed the bug. But the idea of exploiting what we might think of as a weakness in the technology and misusing it is something that hasn't just been the realm of art. If we look, for example, at why we know there's a Big Bang, that discovery was made because people thought that pigeons shat all over the antennae on the roof, and they went to try to clean them off, and lo and behold, they cleaned them off, and they still heard this buzz in the background that turned out to be microwave background radiation that was the strongest evidence for this idea that the universe is expanding. Apollo 13 astronauts had to put together a filter with a piece of duct tape and a couple other random parts that were all they had in the capsule, and managed to save their lives and give them enough oxygen to make it back to Earth. So the idea of working with constraints, and in particular doing things that are not on the label, and sometimes the things that are explicitly sort of prescribed not to do on the label, and sometimes things that just are never mentioned or thought of by other people, that's definitely within the realm of creativity. And I would say that whereas a lot of people can be creative with technology, to be creative specifically in a technological sense means almost always to misuse it.
And so talk more then about this critical piece you want to make sure that we hear from you too.
So this is an interesting sort of a realm of metaphor, and we have to fall into metaphors sometimes talking about AI because it is alien to us. It's a strange neurological process that doesn't resemble too much of what else we've experienced. I think that the tech bros and AI CEOs will tell you, well, it mimics the human brain. And I think it's very different from the human brain. Certainly, deep learning is closer to the human brain than, say, the old expert models of a bunch of if-then statements that somehow encompass the rules for, I don't know, identifying a chair or being able to add, solve two simultaneous equations or something like that. But in our case, the way that these models work and generate information is quite divorced from other things we've seen. So we fall back on metaphors. And Mahabali and some of her co-authors have a really great article on the different kinds of metaphors people are looking at when they identify AI and how they describe what it works and where it fails. I'm actually thinking right now more of metaphors of how we deal with AI, not of the AI itself, but how we deal with it. So there's obviously the embrace, like, oh, let's take this on and we'll accept it. There's the sort of kind of shunning. Oh, this is a pariah. We shouldn't have anything to do with it. In both cases, those are human metaphors, right? We'd embrace a cousin we haven't seen in a long time, but we'd shun someone who is a danger to us. But I'm actually of the mind that an approach that can help, at least for some of us to do as researchers, is what in Tai Chi they call rolling back and pressing forward. It's a sort of two-step process where if you're attacked, and this is sort of imitated in a sort of practice called push hands, where you are in a more gentle way sparring with someone else in Tai Chi Chuan, the martial art. You allow someone's energy to come at you and you just sort of receive it all. But in doing so, you're sort of sensing where they are and where they're pushing and where their weight, where the center of mass is. And then when you're ready, when they've sort of overextended, that's when you can push back. And when you push back, you are not just kind of fighting like, knee-jerk resistance from the get-go. You're responding to their energy and using the information you gathered in the rolling back stage to sort of now be more strategic about what direction you want to push them. And so I think of this as a good metaphor for how to deal with a lot of things, including AI. I don't think it's a great solution to just say, these things are unethical, we shouldn't use them at all, because they're already being used all around us. They're in CV screening software, they're in facial recognition, they're in self-driving cars to the extent those are a thing. And we're sort of giving up our agency to other factors, other forces in the world when we let them decide what directions these systems should go. Whereas if we sort of roll back and accept what these things are, as you just say, play with them, right? Because this form of Tai Chi is a kind of play. We can learn more about how they work and most importantly, where they fail. Once we know that, we can start to push back and say, this is the value they can have for us. This is the direction we want to bend them in. These are the ways we don't want them to go.
Oh my gosh, that's such a powerful metaphor. Thank you for that. And I will definitely put that link in the show notes that you referred to from the authors, Mahabali and others, on those metaphors. But what another powerful one I have not heard spoke of before today. So speaking of people's misunderstanding, what are some of the common things that come up of people not really understanding how it works? I mean, we've heard so many of these metaphors. It's like a calculator. No, actually, it's not. And so how is that breakdown, or a couple of things where you think a lot of people, especially in a higher education space, I think if we can limit it to our group who may be listening to this podcast, people tend to misunderstand about how it works and then not really be able to use this additional metaphor you've added to our collection.
Sure. I'm trying to think of whether I want to pick on the people who are the promoters of the technology or the ones who are squeamish about it first. I think that maybe I would say start with some of the buzzwords that people use when they describe AI that I think are really misleading, right? So the word hallucination is my biggest bugaboo. Yes, they generate falsehoods. No, they are not connected to a trillion cells of a human sensorium with decades worth of experience bumping into real objects in the real world and consequences of that, right? As humans, we feel pain, we trouble our relationships, we succeed at doing something and getting rewarded for it in ways that are not the same as just changing a bunch of weights in a matrix somewhere. So when I hear, and this is a term that comes from not the tech critics, but from the tech champions, when I hear them say, oh, that's just a hallucination, the model is hallucinating, they're referring to, of course, the generation of a falsehood or potentially a nonsensical output after you prompt something into ChatGPT or the like. But that implies a kind of bodily sense of the world, as well as the idea that something went wrong. If you hallucinate now, you see a pink elephant behind me. I swear there's no pink elephant behind me. Your senses and your connection to the brain would be messed up. Something is going wrong, right? You're either got DTs because you drank too much, or you are having a deep psychosis or some kind of neurological problem. That's not normal functioning of the optic nerve and how it connects to the brain. Well, if a language model hallucinates by saying Obama was the first Muslim president, or it's okay to eat rocks as long as you eat small ones, both of which were statements generated by Google's latest foray into AI, namely the AI overviews that they offered as summaries on search result pages. Both of those statements are wrong, but they're not wrong because the LLM did something different than it usually does. The large language model did exactly what it always does, which is to essentially grab the words that are in the prompt, relate them to other words that have been clustered with those words online in billions of web pages that have been scraped from the internet, and then try its best to predict the next words in the sequence. So we can't call it hallucinating if it's what it does when it's not hallucinating. It's simply accidentally wrong, as opposed to something about the process being wrong. So the process is divorced from the real world of right and wrong, correct and incorrect statements. It's its own thing, and there's no difference between an AI that hallucinates and an AI that doesn't, except the sort of vagaries of how it was trained and the specific sort of randomization of responses that goes on in the background. So that's probably my biggest bugaboo for people misunderstanding that this is a kind of software that has bugs. No, a large language model isn't a kind of software that can have bugs. I mean, in principle, some parts of it can, but not the engine of it that generates, thoughts and comments and even imagery and media. It's not even the kind of thing that you can consider software in the conventional sense. There's a bunch of vectors with numbers in them, and there's just some very basic code that essentially recombines those vectors in different ways. So there's no memory leak to be patched. There's no web URL that's broken. It's not like the kind of thing that you would do with traditional software when you needed to fix it. That can lead us to other kinds of claims or words that, again, are used in this industry that I think are very misleading. The idea of guardrails, well, guardrails are something you put to prevent a car from accidentally driving over the edge. But there's a human in the car that can see the guardrail and steer clear of them. There's no one steering a neural network in the conventional sense. The idea that somehow we're going to sort of patch all of these potential holes in the system, there are way more edges of potential vulnerability and failure of a large language model than there are guardrails we could possibly put on them. And that's why years after large language models are introduced, we still see embarrassing failures by major companies where their models spit out things that are either ridiculous or harmful. I could talk about more of these buzzwords, but I think those two give you a sense.
Oh, yeah. And I want to hear the latter half where you would like to share a bugaboo, perhaps about someone who has been more resistant to engaging. But before we do, I would love to take this opportunity to have you talk about this exercise that you've had students do that helps them explore the connecting random things together. Could you talk a little bit about what that exercise is and what it's taught you as well as students that you've worked with?
Sure. So one of the research topics I'm most interested in is creativity. And creativity for AI, anyway, is the inverse of trust, right? A lot of people are worried about, can these things be trusted? Are they reliable, right? And we see many examples when they're not. Well, other people typically are interested in whether they can be creative. Like, is it artwork that's generated by Midjourney or Stable Diffusion really art? Or can it have the same level of aesthetic value or innovation as a human artist? To me, these ideas are intricately related. In fact, they're inversely related. The more creative you are, the more you can't be trusted, to put it bluntly. So when you think about what does creativity mean in the context of a large language model, well, it's hard for us to predict or imagine that the auto predict that sort of gives us the next suggestion on our phone when we start typing something to a friend and pick up some bananas at the grocery, that could be creative. Like, well, how could that be creative? It's just filling in words. Remember that you're dealing with billions of web pages, all of which have words frequencies where, the same word will relate to another word, right? So an example I often give is sort of, you might see pet and dachshund nearby in many web pages. You're probably not going to see pet and velociraptor, right? So velociraptor, the pages that have velociraptor are going to be far in a semantic space away from the pages that have pet or the word dachshund. And so when these models are trained, they start with random parameters, and then over time they're rewarded every time a connection is made that imitates the likelihood that two words appear together in the same way that is the likelihood that they'll appear together in the actual corpus of data that's out there online. So again, to oversimplify, by the time you're done with the training, you should have a vector, which is a bunch of little numbers for every word. So the word pet is going to have something like 12,000 little numbers inside this vector. And each of those corresponds to a word that it may or may not be associated with. The word pet and dachshund, well, that dachshund's actually going to be quite associated with the word pet. So that might be a pretty high percentage for that little number, like, 30% or 10%. The word velociraptor is going to be incredibly low, like 0.0001%. And literally, the training that a AI neural network goes through just generates for every word the sequence of numbers that correspond to its likelihood to appear next to any other word in the training data. So to be creative is to say, well, what if you could have a pet velociraptor? And this is quite strange for us because we know there's no web page. Let's say maybe there is a web page out there with a pet velociraptor in it, someone's fanfic for Jurassic Park, I don't know, but let's suppose there isn't. We would say, well, how could the large language model discover this page or write a story about this if it has never seen these two things combined before? But this is where the idea of averaging comes in. And again, to somewhat oversimplify, when you write a bunch of words in your prompt, let's say you're working with an image generator like Stable Diffusion or Midjourney or DALL-E. You say, hey, show me a picture of a pet dachshund. It's going out and finding phrases and websites that include pet and dachshund and associating them with a picture. And this is easy to do on the web because pictures have captions and alt tags for accessibility behind the scenes in the HTML. So it's going to go through and find the pictures that are associated with the words pet and dachshund, and it's going to, in a rather fancy way, average those pictures to give you a result. And you will see a girl walking a pet dachshund. Well, if you ask the same image generator, show me a pet velociraptor, I want a girl walking a pet velociraptor. It may have never seen any of those pictures, but it still can find the pictures, the web pages associated with girl and dachshund, and pet and velociraptor, and then sort of average those pictures together. And that's how you get a girl walking a pet velociraptor out of Midjourney or Stable Diffusion or DALL-E. This is an extraordinary thing technically, and I can go into how it happens behind the scenes, but I think it's beyond the scope of this podcast. More to the point, it's an example of the kind of creativity that these systems can do, can be possible. That it is both a problem, it's a curse and a blessing. It's a problem because the average of two facts is not necessarily a fact. So you're going to get something from a result that you query that isn't true, and we would call that hallucinating. But that's simply because essentially the chatbot is looking at all the words in the prompt and averaging all of those words to find the midpoint of those words. And it could be that there's a word there or a sequence of words that makes perfect sense, like girl with a pet dachshund. Or it could be that those words, the average of those, the sort of midpoint of all of those, vectors in this abstract mathematical space, is something for which there hasn't ever been a web page. There's nothing in the training data for that because no one's ever thought of having a pet velociraptor before. And yet the AI is capable of generating a sequence of words just like it would normally from the averages of all the words in the prompt. And that to me is quite interesting because it means that although the average of two facts isn't necessarily a fact, the average of two cliches isn't necessarily a cliche either. That's where novelty and creativity can come from. That's why we get to ask it to create a haiku about quantum mechanics or the script for a romantic comedy about the French Revolution. It's incredibly good at generating these kind of hybrid. And I hope that gives you a sense of why I think the idea of the creativity of these systems and the reliability are sort of inversely related, and understanding where the novelty comes from helps us distinguish between times we should use it, where kind of creativity is valued, versus times when we shouldn't, where reliability is required.
Oh, and you're just perfectly, it's almost like you've talked about this stuff before, because that's exactly where I wanted to go next. The division that I lead at our university, we had it write for us a traditional holiday story that many children read. And we was terrible at it, but it was extremely low stakes. And what I find so joyful as I think to that experience, we have such a diverse group of people that I'm privileged to work with, and every single one of those people all got engaged in one way or another. Some people were highly engaged. Some people were just, hey, let's change this wording. But it was so fun to be a part of that. But yeah, it didn't matter that it wasn't a great creative endeavor. And we made it better. Every single one of us made it better. But I would love to have you talk, because I was surprised in doing the research to prepare for today by some of the things you revealed about looking at high stakes versus low stakes. And then another factor that I hadn't thought of before, opportunity versus prescription. So can you kind of walk us through, this might be a different way for many of us of thinking about when we may or may not wish to use artificial intelligence?
Sure. I'd love to hear more about the sort of engaging quality of your group work with writing a story. I often think about, if I'd had this when my kids were young, I could have had ChatGPT write bedtime stories involving their favorite imaginary characters.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's immense potential there for education. Anyway.
Yeah.
So when we think about reliability versus dangers, one of the first determinants that comes to mind is, high stakes versus low stakes, right? That makes sense, right? These things are creative but unreliable. So of course, I'm going to give it tasks that are sort of trivial or unimportant. Whereas something that's really critical that absolutely needs to be done, I'm not going to task an AI to solve that. I think that's wrong. I think that's kind of tempting, but it's easy to find examples that don't work according to that kind of dichotomy. So one of the big success stories of artificial intelligence is in certain realms of healthcare. One of the first job categories to be endangered, well before ChatGPT, was radiologists who look at x-rays for a living and identify potential tumors and the like. There's lots of other examples, that many of which have to do with medical imaging, because that sort of machine vision was an early sort of research angle before the natural language processing got up to speed. Well, that's not low stakes. That's really high stakes, right? You have cancer in your lungs, you want to know. But the difference is, it's not about, do you know whether any one of these blobs that the AI identified is definitely cancer. It's, can it simply identify a bunch of things that should be screened and looked at more closely, perhaps biopsied in the worst case scenario. So it's an example of something that's really important, but for which AI is in some ways, according to numerous studies, more valuable than a human researcher, at least in the initial stages. Well, certainly then there are cases where why would it ever be a problem then to use AI for low stakes? I mean, we could sort of like at least keep that half of the dichotomy. I think that's also wrong. I taught a class last year online where we use Slack as our LMS. I don't like folder-based, clunky, constipated learning management systems. I like a very dialogic, like conversational courseware, even for an asynchronous online class. And it's been great for a lot of reasons. But this past year, one student was giving pretty predictable responses. And they weren't even bad responses. They were just sort of like generic, and they sounded a lot like an AI chatbot. And so I called this person on it and I said, look, I don't mind that you're using it. In fact, there are numerous places in the syllabus where I recommend you use AI and try it out. But responding to classmates with that kind of human touch that I'm trying to encourage in class dialogue is not a good use of this program. Does it matter? Not that much, in the sense that it didn't impact the person's grade. It also doesn't matter if you write a thank you note to, your boss thanks you for your contributions this year by writing something that sounds like it came from ChatGPT. It's not you're being fired or hired. It's not a strategic decision. It's just a thank you note. Who cares? It's low stakes. Well, I care. I don't want ChatGPT writing thank you notes to me, right? I don't want a boss pretending like they're connecting with me on a human level and really using an AI to do it. And similarly, I want a class conversation, even over trivial things like, hey, good idea, or I'll have to check out that link. I want those to be real, even if they're informal, casual, kind of one-off responses. So one way of thinking about that might be, well, it's low stakes in the short term, but in the longer term, you're basically degrading the human relationships that are essential to this community or connection or class or whatever. But I think that these are examples that show you that high stakes versus low stakes isn't really the right dichotomy to think about when to use AI and when not.
And I think part of what I'm hearing you say, or maybe it's what you're not saying, is that perhaps even a dichotomy isn't the best way to think about this at all. Maybe because you've already introduced another one. Instead of high stakes versus low stakes, you've also introduced this, what the outcomes might be. But I don't know. I wanted to ask you how this relates to your thinking on feedback to students on assignments that they're doing. I have been troubled, to say the least, about the ways in which there are often visceral reactions by faculty. How dare students cheat on an assignment? In a way, they're defining cheating as making use of AI. But the same, I think, logic that they're using doesn't apply of anything that would save faculty time. And I want to be very careful how I talk about this, because I've been reminded of and I'm thoughtful enough, I think, self-reflective to realize I sit in a privileged place. I'm not teaching classes of 200 with 0 TAs to speak of. And so our contexts are different, but that same thing that you talked about, I had colleagues I finally confessed to them, and they didn't mind at all, that the formal letters in support of their applications, their portfolios for promotion or tenure, ChatGPT does a far better job than I ever will. They're not only faster, but better. And so they were like, why are you apologizing to me? But those same colleagues, these are the dearest of dear friends. I wouldn't even think to write a thank you note that was at all generated. So in terms of feedback to students, what's some of the thinking you have around that? Using AI, not using AI? And I want to be nuanced about it myself.
Yeah, it's a great question, and very much in the news now with the revelations of sort of education adjacent services and companies like Khan Academy kind of promoting this idea of like, well, we can automate all aspects of student assessment and so forth. I personally think that it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I do recognize there's some contexts in which relying on AI-generated assessment can be fairer, but there's a lot of context where it's not. And studies of, for example, people who speak non-standard English or use dialects that are not sort of standard white people talk can be disadvantaged. Even names. I saw a study recently, which I will have to look up, in which someone submitted the exact same assignment to one of these chatbots, but simply changed the names to different ethnic groups, right? So one sounded very clearly like a sort of white American, and others sounded Indian or Chinese or like Black American. And they got very different scores on exactly the same assignment that was submitted. But I think there's a difference between grading and feedback. And I think, in my experience, the chatbots can be incredibly valuable at offering perspectives on writing or other assignments that are not part of the student's original thinking, especially when prompted correctly. Now, you might say, well, Jon, that's totally contradictory, because on one hand, you're saying like these bots are biased against certain groups. And on the other side, you're saying they're good at sort of encouraging students to look beyond their own personal biases at exactly the kind of issues of these same groups. And I think both are true. Two computer scientists, Greg Nelson, Troy Schotter, and I, in the fall, conducted a semester-long experiment with 50 students. And we had them do 7 tasks without AI and 7 tasks with AI. And one of the tasks with AI was to essentially submit a work of theirs, not just for our class, but actually for other classes, into, in this case, GPT-4, and then ask what the grade would be and get feedback. And the results are still coming in. We're going to publish this coming year, I hope. But preliminarily, it looks like students were sort of felt equally more or less about both kinds of feedback. It turns out that ChatGPT was a harder grader. I think that was kind of circumstantial, had to do with it not really understanding the level of the class. So they tended to get worse grades. The feedback was more sort of all-encompassing, whereas the human TAs tended to focus more on specific pieces rather than try to capture all the bases. But the other interesting factor was the feedback meant more coming from a human. They knew this person was a flesh and blood creature reading their essay or looking at their image or whatever, and they appreciated that aspect.
Oh, it's fascinating. Now, I don't want to forget to ask you to then describe the exercise that you ran with students to help them experience this things coming together that are seemingly disconnected. Yeah.
Yeah. So I gave the sort of sketch of how large language models work by averaging what's surrounding them, even if that explores a part of the space for which there's few data points. And I described that as kind of creativity, not necessarily creativity of the sort that invents a new scientific theory or a new art genre out of nothing, but the kind that sort of mashes up things and creates hybrids. So the assignment is pick one from column A and one from column B and ask ChatGPT to find the connection between them. And they're deliberately from the exact opposite realms of the world. So, what's the relationship between Taylor Swift and the Big Bang? Or what's the relationship between aardvarks and the Industrial Revolution? It's just trying to go as far out as you can. And what surprises students is how, instead of balking at this, like, well, there is no relationship, increasingly, the companies have started to add guardrails that say something like that, like, well, there isn't any direct connection between Taylor Swift and the Big Bang, but, and then it will go on and say, both of them are disruptive forces and that have created entire new, and it'll go on and sort of explain in this bullshitting way, but actually also creative way, connections between them. I think in one case, a student asked, what's the difference, or what's the connection between a chupacabra, which is a sort of cryptid, this kind of scary goat type creature that's a kind of fiction, sort of like Sasquatch or Loch Ness Monster. What's the connection between the chupacabra and dark energy, dark matter? And it turned out that it came up with this whole theory of quantum entanglement being the way the chupacabra could appear and disappear. So it's definitely a wonderful exercise because it's so quick to do. And I think rather than just being a parlor trick, it's also a good lesson as to how these things work. Anytime you are generating an answer, it's using that same kind of averaging, trying to find the sort of midpoint between these other words or prompts. And so if you realize that this is what's happening when it makes a connection between Taylor Swift and the Big Bang, you can also realize that that's how it's generating results that sound plausible, but may not be true.
I haven't tried on this analogy yet, and I will admit to being rather feeble at them, but I'm kind of thinking back to you talking about guardrails and the rightful criticism about that, asking these big AI companies to build these in, and self-regulate. That's not necessarily it, but I'm feeling like you and so many others that have been working out in the open and experimenting and sharing what you're coming up with and working with students have been helping so many of us, rather than choosing between one dichotomy. I'm either going to put my head in the sand, act like this doesn't exist, and act like I can police my way into never having students use it, or the other extreme, to use it irresponsibly without realizing some of the true ethical things that have been baked into the systems because they were built by humans and they're being trained on language that is filled with bias. So anyway, I just want to, I guess, thank you for the guardrails, but maybe I don't know if guardrails is the right thing because I'm not sure if you're doing more than helping, at least in my case, me avoid a crash, if that makes any sense. You're helping me go on a wild adventure I might not have been able to go were it not for you and people like you in this grand adventure we're on.
Oh, that's very thoughtful. I don't think of them as guardrails. I think you have to choose the vehicle for the right kind of trip, right? And this is where the prescriptive versus opportunistic task comes in. And you're not going to use a dune buggy to drive around Maine in the middle of a blizzard, and you shouldn't be using these tools for tasks that aren't amenable to finding these sort of randomized averages. So my sort of framework for making choices here, when to use it and when not, depends on two things. One is there's a whole battery of rightful criticisms that have to do that kind of come from the outside that are sort of I don't know, maybe circumstantial, you might say. So they're not specifically about how the engine works. They're about the context in which these things were created. So things like bias in the training data. We know there's bias against people of other cultures and genders and races. Things like exploitation of workers who in the third world are going through looking at horrific imagery of like, sexual violence so that these things get stripped out of the things we see in the first world. There's plagiarism accusations from artists whose work is being used so that someone can type in the style of Greg Rakowski, and lo and behold, there's a Greg Rakowski painting that he never painted. There's monopolization that, the fact that we used to worry that there were 5 main media companies. Now there's basically 2 or 3, thanks to the huge compute powers of AI. There's carbon impact. So there's all of these sort of external factors that might make you say, look, I'm not going to use this at all. But when we look internally to say, okay, if we disregard those and just say what task does this engine work well for? That's where I think we can think about a framework that distinguishes between what I call opportunistic versus prescriptive tasks. So going back to the healthcare example, finding a potential tumor, if you find one and it turns out not to be a tumor, well, that's distressful for the patient. Maybe they even had to go through some surgery to get it biopsied. But it's better than not finding the tumor that was there, the third one down. So to me, that's an opportunistic task. We are trying to look for chances of things that might be true, even if we get some of them wrong. We'd rather have a kind of big net and capture what we can. And then on the opposite is prescriptive tasks. So again, for the healthcare analogy, that's like, dosing your grandpa's heart medication, right? You don't want to just kind of take a whirl and say, hey, let's just kind of switch around some pills and see what happens to him tomorrow. He might be dead. That's something where you've got to get the dosage right. That's it's literally prescriptive tasks. That's why we call it prescriptions. So on the one hand, you have tasks where you just kind of want to generate a lot of possibilities. And if some of them work, that's great. And on the other hand, you have tasks where you've got to get it right. You got to get every aspect of it right. I think the second half is a terrible idea for most generative AI. And the first kind of category is actually a really good use of AI. And we can look at that in all kinds of different fields, from being a creative designer or artist, their impact in politics, which is something we didn't talk about today, their role in education. So all of these are fields where we have to decide when we're going to use this and when we're not. And I think as much as it's great to be able to choose individual cases, case by case, but it's also helpful to think about what is the probabilistic engine that generates these possibilities, and under what tasks do we want kind of opportunistic solutions, and what tasks do we want a more well-defined, certain, reliable, prescriptive solution?
This is the time in the show where we each get to share our recommendations. And since I totally don't want to stop this conversation, I'm going to invite listeners to keep it going. And that is that I invite you to follow Jon on your most preferred social network. Jon, it looked like you have quite a few going. So I most connect with Jon and his work on LinkedIn, but I saw that you got plenty other listed. So I'll make sure those are in the show notes. I don't know if you have advice for people if they only had to pick one where you're able to engage the most, 1 or 2 spots. Is there any suggestions you have for people?
Well, thanks to Elon, it's become a total mess, and I find myself distracted between 6 different platforms, including Facebook, which I thought I would never go back to. So I tend to post first to Mastodon. It is the most decentralized and the least corporate, and I find there's no algorithm in charge. It's really about people. But I'll answer you wherever you post.
Okay, great. And then the second thing I wanted to recommend is, ironically, a website that I found about while I was researching for the conversation with Jon today. And that is a website called Data by Design. And I found out as I started exploring the website that it's actually just a very open, and they're receiving feedback on what will be an MIT Press book in the fall of 2025. So I'll read a little bit from their About section. Data visualization is not a recent innovation. Even in the 18th century, activists and economists, as well as educators and politicians, were fully aware of the power of visualization to produce new knowledge. But who, more precisely, was wielding this power, on whose behalf, and for whose benefit? The answer The answers to these questions are what this project explores. By retelling the history of data visualization alongside the histories of colonialism and slavery, we show how questions of ethics and justice have always been present and continue to offer lessons to viewers and designers of data visualizations today. And I was chatting a little bit, speaking of social media, I was chatting a little bit with a many-time prior guest, Rami Kalir, today. And he is going to be coming out with a book through MIT Press. I forgot when his release date is, but he was talking about they're just a really good publisher for open access to their publications, and also this annotating and feedback process happening very much out in the open too. So all sorts of things for us to explore. And if you go visit Data by Design, it kind of doesn't matter what your interest is. It's going to drag you in, whether you're interested in data, in web development, or if you're interested in art or humanities. I mean, so many things. So I really think it's worth a visit. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jon for whatever he would like to recommend to us as we close out the episode.
Sure. Well, I'll put in a word for MIT Press as well, since I'm sort of negotiating with them to open access a book that I published with them about 10 years ago. And the idea of what a publication means in the 21st century, and especially after the rise of generative AI, is a really interesting question. And fortunately, they're open to that dialogue. So my recommendation, can I have two little ones?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first one is by Brian Alexander's book, Universities on Fire, which is about how higher education will be buffeted by climate change and how it should respond. Don't read it. Just don't even send it to your house. Send it to your administrator. Send it to your college dean. Send it to your president. That's what I did in my case, because, of course, I read it as well. But I think it's actually, honestly, more important that you get the book into as many people's hands as you can, especially people who are in a position to realize that universities need a shakeup if they're going to confront the timely issues of our day. Second piece of advice or recommendation is more of a practice, which is you may be teaching writing, you may be teaching programming, computer science, history, whatever. Get your students to try generating images with AI, even if it's a class that has nothing to do with media or art or design. The reason is that many of the sort of internal workings of these engines that are kind of hidden by the chatbot interface are made plain by the interfaces of something like Stable Diffusion. And I think that we forget when we only see a single sort of oracular, godlike answer to our prompts, that these are not machines that have knowledge of the world or even models of the world. I would argue that they don't. You can see this most easily when you go to something like Stable Diffusion, Leonardo.ai, DALL-E, and so forth, especially the ones that have the more complex interfaces, and they can be a little off-putting at first. But there are so many bells and whistles and levers you can pull to get different results. You can choose the model, and you see very different kind of images depending on which model is under the hood, right? You usually almost always generate multiple images at once. You don't just get one answer, you get four. And you're like, whoa, okay, I gave up with these four different things. Why? Because it's probabilistic, and it's always generating random answers, even when you ask for text. It makes it very obvious that things are wrong, right? So you might generate something about, I don't know, the death of Robespierre, and there's a detail that's wrong there, but you don't know because you're not a French historian. But if you see someone with 6 fingers, then you know it's probably not an accurate representation that you got back from the model. And I think also one big thing that's important is this idea that, yes, there is bias in the training data, but there's also bias in the very act of averaging. So there's this concept called the midpoint hottie, which means if you prompt something like Stable Diffusion, I want to see a construction worker. I want to see a typical female doctor. They're going to look hot. They're going to be beautiful. You're going to fall in love with them. You go, wow, that woman is, incredible. Is she average? Well, in a strange way, yes. Not typical, not the way we would say, but average in the sense that studies have suggested that if you take all different kinds of body, kind of images and portraits and sort of compose them together, you get something that actually looks attractive. And we could talk about why, due to regularity of facial features and expectations. But that problem, that's technically a problem called the midpoint hottie problem, is something that's very hard for engineers to deal with. Because every time you ask for an average person, you're going to get someone who looks beautiful. That is not because there's beautiful people online. Of course, there are more probably portraits of people who look attractive than the ones they picked that were deliberately ugly they put online. But the real problem is the averaging dynamic of these systems. And if you really want to understand the limits of that process, of that way of producing results, image generators are a great way to see it visually.
Oh, Jon, I could keep going. I'm so grateful for you and for your work, for your agreeing in less than 24 hours to talk with me, because otherwise I guess you said we would have talked in 6 months. So what a pleasure to get this opportunity to speak with you and to hopefully spread the word about the work that you do. And I'm just so excited about continuing to learn from you as well. What a invigorating conversation that I wish I could keep going for the next few hours, but you probably have other things to do in your day. I know you're about to start traveling. Thank you so much for this time and for your generous contributions to so many of us who are trying to wrestle with this stuff and learn.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thanks once again to Jon Ippolito for being a guest on today's episode. Today's episode of Teaching in Higher Ed was produced by me, Bonnie Stachowiak. It was edited by the ever-talented Andrew Kroger. Podcast production support was provided by the amazing Sierra Priest. Thanks to each one of you for listening. If you have yet to sign up for the weekly Teaching in Higher Ed updates, I encourage you to head over to teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. You'll receive the most recent episodes, show notes, as well as other resources that don't show up in those regular show notes. So head on over to teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time on Teaching in Higher Ed.